Hey everyone. So the upcoming workshop will deal with essentially two aspects of persuasion. The first half of the workshop will be on propaganda, and the second half will be on the corporations and the organizations who have used and continue to use manipulative strategies and persuasive techniques to really control, to transform us from considering ourselves human beings with priorities of caring more about clean air and family and friends and that sort of thing, to considering ourselves consumers where we prioritize convenience and material objects, money and paying bills and that sort of thing, as a far higher matter, which has led us to the sort of economic system that we have today. We'll also be looking at the symbology used and the historical context of how these organizations have been able to communicate a value set to one another just using these simple symbologies. So we'll be looking at quite a few different things. So within the first half, I'll be going into discussing how to analyze propaganda. So we'll be looking at how to analyze propaganda campaigns. So I'll also be including 4 case studies for us to examine. The point being so that we can work out how to analyze propaganda and understand if a campaign's trying to persuade us to believe something. These case studies will include women in the workplace, big pharma. I'll also be giving you a case study to look at the current sorts of campaigns like Adani and the Stop Adani campaign, and the meat and dairy industry. So we'll be dealing with topics such as economic slavery, humanism versus consumerism, ecology versus economy, and the natural environment. I won't go into it too much. Obviously, propaganda has been used for a long time, for thousands of years, but it wasn't really till the Greeks, back in ancient Greece, that they started really studying propaganda and persuasion techniques and looking at it more as a science. So the people who studied propaganda, like Aristotle and Socrates, really looked into developing a lot more precise techniques, and these people that studied propaganda and persuasion techniques were considered rhetoricians. After the Greeks, they studied a lot of the majority, even still today, a lot of the things that a lot of the marketing strategies that are used come from ancient Greece. After that, it's obviously went on to more government-based, where it was the Roman Empire become the next largest users of propaganda, where they really used propaganda for their people and to try and create a lot more support for their empire. This sort of then naturally progressed on to the church and the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church obviously becoming one of the largest distributors of propaganda at the time. That then created opposition. So there were people like Martin Luther who opposed the Catholic Church. He then come away and originally started in sort of very basic activism against the Catholic Church, doing more outreach propaganda sorts of stuff, and then with the invention of the printing press, this really created a huge change in the way to distribute propaganda, and Martin Luther was one of the first people to use the printing press in that way and to understand how important media can be for persuading people and for getting information out. So Martin Luther was actually one of the first people to use this form of propaganda, and Martin Luther was actually the first person to create flyer-based outreach. So anyone today that's out doing flyering for animal activism or environmental activism, that's actually where it all started, where it came from. After this, after there was a separation of church and state, government obviously were well aware by then of the effective forms of propaganda and persuasive techniques from the church and from Martin Luther, and seeing the success that Martin Luther had against the church, as well as obviously the success of recruiting millions of people around the world through the churches, the government started using these same sorts of campaigns, and actually bringing in people like Edward Bernays and his techniques, and who then included a lot of psychology into it, where they started using psychoanalysts, and today now use neuropsychology and a whole range of other techniques, and then also incorporating all these old propaganda techniques as well. So there's a lot of study and a lot of money that's gone into it. Apart from government, after the use of propaganda with government, naturally with capitalism and that sort of thing, corporations then started using propaganda a lot more, and there started becoming a lot more sort of vested interest and connections between corporations and government, where they both sort of started working together a lot more in propaganda campaigns. And then, of course, today we have things like Hollywood, in India, Bollywood, in Korea, the whole K-pop industry, in Japan, the J-pop industry, all of this pop culture and Hollywood films, forms of entertainment and media, are also a huge form of propaganda that's able to really shape people's views, value sets, philosophies, beliefs in nationalism and their government and that sort of thing, really change the whole views of society, which has become the main form of persuasive techniques these days, as well as advertising. And probably the most current form of propaganda and most largest form of propaganda these days is alternative media. Ever since social media and YouTube and things like that have become popular, we're now seeing some of the biggest propaganda campaigns probably since it first really started a lot with corporations back in the 60s and 70s. This is the largest amount of persuasive campaigns going, as well as things like conspiracy theories, a lot of different a lot of company-based campaigns, advertising, greenwashing, all this sort of thing that's going on the internet, is all huge forms of old propaganda that's been going on for years. It's just all started coming out and being used again through internet. So to start with, I just really want to go into the techniques and the terms, just to give everyone a brief idea. I will be showing a few short examples, both video and image-based examples, but I really want to just make it quite simple. There's not enough time at all with how long this workshop's going to be to go into each one of these techniques, so I'm basically just going to mention them, give a brief explanation of what they are. For some of them I'll give some samples, but really it's more for you just to get an idea, understand the names and stuff, and then look into it for yourself. So I really hope a lot of people will write down a lot of these techniques and information, and then later go into study some of them, especially some of the persuasive techniques that I'll be talking about are things that will take a year or more to study just that one technique, to fully understand it. So it's really going to be a number of years of study if you want to really fully understand some of these terms and techniques.
Does that work for you? Because of their purchasing power and because of their purchasing influence, marketers and advertisers have become much more deliberate in their strategies and attempts to how to influence those dollars.
Sienna, because kids come first.
It's the children who often determine what kind of car gets bought, what kind of computer gets bought, what kind of cell phone program, and even where they take family holidays.
What's your favorite part of the Nick Hotel?
The awesome pools, having my own room, the arcade rocks. I like the shops. I like eating with SpongeBob.
We came on vacation and the kids don't ever want to leave.
Most parents and other people just don't realize how corporate marketers intentionally try to, well, in essence, make parents absolutely miserable. Corporate marketers have actually studied the whole nagging phenomenon, which corporations do nagging better, and they provide advice to corporations about, what kinds of tantrums work better.
Children sometimes say, can I, as much as 9 times.
Will you take us to Mount Splashmore? No. Will you take us to Mount Splashmore? No. Will you take us to Mount Splashmore?
No.
And part of the nag factor is designed to help maximize the number of times children will keep asking and keep asking.
No!
Will you take us to Mount Splashmore? Will you take us to Mount Splashmore?
If I take you, will you two shut up and quit bugging me?
Yeah, of course. Well, will you take us to Mount Splashmore?
Yes!
Thanks, Dad.
So these kids have a lot of power in the economy. The advertisers know it, and they are going after them in a way that is unprecedented.
It's the place where I want to be.
This generation of children is marketed to as never before. Kids are being marketed to through brand licensing, through product placement, marketing in schools, through stealth marketing, through viral marketing. There's DVDs, there's video games, there's the internet, there are iPods, there are cell phones. There are so many more ways of reaching children so that there's a brand in front of a child's face every moment of every day.
What we have is the rise of 360-degree immersive marketing, where they try and get around the child at every aspect, at every avenue.
Some 4 great games.
Kids are inundated with this. They are buried in this media blitz.
Kids are now multitasking with media.
Hello? Hey girl, what's up? No way.
You gotta plug in your iPod or MP3 player.
Yeah, new music.
They are using more than one medium at the same time. So they're surfing the web, and the television's going with MTV, and they've got the iPod with one earbud in, and they are more vulnerable and are bombarded with over 3,000 commercial messages every day.
Their goal is to insinuate their brands into the fabric of children's lives.
So many children's characters' principal function is really to hook kids on products. They're designed to pull on kids' heartstrings.
It's your chance to make The Little Mermaid part of your world.
And then who's holding the strings? Well, it's the marketers who want to sell kids a wide variety of products.
So you end up having junk food promotions at fast food restaurants, breakfast cereals with images of the main characters from the movies. You have bed sheets so the children literally go to bed thinking about the images, and then they go to school with their backpacks and their lunch boxes with the logos. And then they get to school and their friends have on the t-shirts and the shoes and they want them.
Hello, Scooby-Doo crackers.
Scooby-Doo? Do you like those?
Yeah.
Have you ever had them?
No.
How do you know you like them?
I love so.
SpongeBob SquarePants was Kraft's best-selling macaroni and cheese. I personally know a 5-year-old who told her father in no uncertain terms that SpongeBob SquarePants macaroni and cheese tastes better than any other macaroni and cheese. Now, how do you argue with a 5-year-old about that? I mean, what do you say? You say, well, no, it doesn't. And then she says, well, yeah, it does. Well, no, really, it does. No, it does. I know it does. Well, have you ever had SpongeBob SquarePants macaroni and cheese? No, but I know that it tastes better.
So the first is appeal to authority. This is a pretty common thing that goes on in advertising and politics, where we'll have celebrities endorsing certain products. We'll have authorities like police or something supporting a certain political campaign, scientists and doctors supporting certain campaigns or advertisements. You'll always quite often see, like if you go back years ago to the 60s where doctors were supporting cigarettes as being healthy, to today where doctors are spruiking vitamins and that sort of thing through advertisements and big pharmaceuticals. You'll have scientists on a whole range of sides where politicians will use cherry-picking techniques with scientists to try and have them come out and say that something like climate change or something doesn't have as much data or isn't real or something like that. And then you'll have the other side of it where they'll bring other scientists out that try and show data that is saying it is real. And that sort of thing just like creates a lot of confusion, which is really the whole purpose of the campaign. So appeal to authority is a common thing that's used. Even ex-politicians you'll see in advertisements, and a lot of celebrities like sports stars and musicians will quite often be put in to promote products that don't really have anything to do with their career or what their knowledge or expertise is, but because they're popular and they have a lot of people who support them and like them, you'll quite often see appeals to authority being used in marketing campaigns. We have appeal to prejudice is another fairly common thing that's used more in politics, where they'll use loaded words or values to try and push one of their campaigns. This is a common thing that's used in things like Q&A debates and that sort of thing, where they'll put together really emotive words or try and have the whole with us or against us value sets that they'll use in arguments to try and get people to support a political policy or something that they're saying that doesn't really have anything to do with what that actual policy is or what their campaign's all about. The other thing is bandwagon. This is another term that's commonly used. It's the sort of the everyone else campaign. The join the crowd campaign is what it's more known as. So for an example, the old campaigns to sell Slinkies, where it was like everyone loves a Slinky, that sort of thing, to make people feel like everyone supports that idea or wants to buy that product to get more people going and buying it. Beautiful people is another term that's used in advertising, where they'll literally just have images of attractive that's at the time considered aesthetically attractive people to promote anything from like normal products and clothing to cosmetics. Health and fitness is a very common thing, where they'll try and show people that are looking healthy and happy, and then associate that with the product, as if you go and buy that product, you're going to suddenly become the at the time view of what's attractive and healthy, or if you go and join that gym, you're going to suddenly become muscular and appealing to people. So the next thing is the big lie. This is basically repetition of something that's untrue. They'll usually mix truth with lies and continually repeat those mixed truths. And by doing that through a campaign, after a while, the actual truth becomes less commonly known, and people just start to believe the lies. There's the black and white techniques, which is basically the with us or against us technique, the one or the other. This is a sort of like political campaigns people run quite often. If you consider back during the Iraq War with George Bush, where he quite literally used that exact term as part of the political campaign to support the Iraq War, where he was literally saying you're either with us or against us. This is a pretty common thing that's used in politics. they play off nationalism and that sort of thing. But it's also used a bit in advertising as well. Then we have cherry picking, which is basically selected truth. It's basically you tell a lie or misinform the public with a mix of truth. You'll often see this with scientific tests, where if you actually understood how to analyze the data and look at the data, you'd understand whatever the political campaign is or the advertising made no sense. But because the majority of people don't have a whole lot of literacy in science, they'll just pick little pieces of data from a scientific report and then use that for part of whatever view or campaign they're trying to get people to believe, and put it out enough that people start doubting actual scientific facts. Then we have classical conditioning. So this is basically if A is present when B is present, then when presented with the absence of B, the same reaction will be expected. Then we have cognitive dissonance. So this is one term, sort of term that I'm talking about, that would be worth doing some more study into and looking into a lot more. If you look up Fessinger, he was the creator of this cognitive dissonance theory. Essentially, it's basically just denial. It's basically when someone's committed themselves so much to a certain type of work or a certain belief, that when it might be shown to be untrue, they'll form cognitive dissonance. So that's something I'll leave that for people to look into a bit more. There's the common man term, which is basically the appeal to the plain folks, or similar values as the general public. This is something very commonly used by politicians, where they might be a billionaire businessman that inherited all this money from their wealthy family, from where their father had given them everything from the moment they were born, never really had any understanding of the common people, but they'll still present themselves in a way when doing political speeches to try and make out as if they've been a hard worker and just like everyone else and just a common man. There's cult of personality. This is a little bit disturbing. This is like a very common thing that's used with celebrities, that sort of thing. So it's basically the use of mass media and propaganda to make a person out to be a hero or a savior to the general public. This is exactly what the early National Socialists done with Hitler, with creating fascism and the Nazis. This is a very common thing that happens with dictatorships. But it's also something that's started being used as well within both politics and advertising and within the celebrity world, where quite often they'll do this sort of thing as well with celebrities so that people will take their opinions and if they're forming campaigns, they'll believe them a lot more. There's the door in the face technique. So this is a common thing used by shops and companies, where a person increases the price of an item and then presents the item as a sale, reducing the item back to the regular price. So obviously the people get no benefit. There's nothing different, but they think they're getting a sale, so they go and buy the product. There's dysphemism. This is basically, so to explain that, a euphemism is an innocuous word used in place of something offensive, whereas a dysphemism is the opposite. There's euphoria. So the use of an event to create euphoria or happiness to manipulate the public to associate the messages or organizations with that happiness from the event. This is also used with things like Happy Meals, that sort of thing, where McDonald's will present a kid with a really fun experience when they go there, a bunch of food and a toy. So as they get older, they always associate McDonald's with a fun as being a fun place to go. It's a common thing that's used now with companies where they're starting to put on free little events or fun little nights. So people go in and think that it's this wonderful thing and then associate that fun or socializing that they had with that company or that product.
It's controlled. There's usually a one-way mirror, so we can see behavioral cues. It's how they look, it's the look in their eyes, especially with kids who don't have that sense yet of self-monitoring. You know, all their actions are very descriptive, and once we take what they say and then feed that in with how they look when they say it and their behavioral cues, we really end up with a strong measurement of how product affects them.
Still another means is ethnographic research, which, tuned to the goals of marketers, has become a kind of scientific stalking.
They go into supermarkets with them and film exactly how they look at a product, pick it up, put it back down, the way they move around a supermarket. They film them on the playground. They film them in school. They film them eating breakfast. They film them going into their closet and deciding what to wear.
What are the things that you need that aren't in here?
I need a lot of...
They film them talking to their friends. They organize little friendship circles and film what they're doing. They even follow them into the bathroom. I interviewed a number of people who sat and watched children take baths and showers, watched how they interact with shampoo and soap and health and beauty products, as that category is called, in order to go back and write a report for their clients on, what to do with the packaging. It's creepy. It's just absolutely creepy, the way children are being dissected and put under the microscope by marketers.
This is new consumer science, and it's yielding a new science of childhood. And perhaps nowhere else have the different elements of this science merged so seamlessly as in the Girls' Intelligence Agency.
Not the CIA, it's the Girls' Intelligence Agency, which, for all the cloak and dagger, is actually a marketing firm.
The Girls' Intelligence Agency claims to have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of girls across the country that it is in contact with and working with. The signature product of the GIA is something called the Slumber Party in a Box.
Guys, sacred opening of the case.
Kids are asked to sort of push a certain product, or they're more like focus group parties where kids are asked to come and give their opinions on products.
What is the hottest item? The sleep mask, the fuzzy phone, or the beauty kits? Fuzzy phone.
They ask them to be sly. They ask them to get information on their friends without their friends knowing about it. It's teaching children to exploit their friends for the purpose of getting money or free products.
What happened at your home the other day, marketing, or was it a party?
It's kind of both. It was a party for us, but it was marketing for the companies.
And is that cool with you?
Definitely.
One of the more problematic aspects of its behavior is that it will enlist young children in its marketing efforts without their parents knowing about it.
There's a lot that's happening around us, and the public is not aware, just like they're not aware of neuromarketing. And that's another whole scary thing, to put a child in an MRI and then watch what is lighting up inside his brain based on the stimulus, and then saying, wow, this works, this is good, look what happens.
They do blink tests on kids, for example. They develop ads and then see how frequently a kid blinks or turns their eyes away. And when they see the kid blinking more, they change the ad to make it more mesmerizing. There's stuff they just can't take their eyes off. And it's not an accident. They've gone over and over and over with extensive high-tech kinds of testing devices to find the precise configuration of characters, colors, music, words, and so forth that kids can't resist.
They want to spend time understanding child development, understanding the child's need to belong, a child's need for community, a child's need for independence, to encourage children to buy.
And somebody asked me, Lucy, is that ethical? You're essentially manipulating these children. Well, yeah, is it ethical? I don't know. But our role at Initiative is to move products. And if we know you move products with a certain creative execution, placed in a certain type of media vehicle, then we've done our job. They are tomorrow's consumer, tomorrow's adult consumer. So start talking with them now, build that relationship when they're younger, and you've got them as an adult.
I'll say it. These marketers are very similar to pedophiles, okay? They are child experts. If you're going to be a pedophile or a child marketer, you have to know about children and what children are going to want.
Kids love advertising. It's a gift. It's something they want. There's something to be said, by the way, about being there first and about branding children and owning them in that way. And antisocial behavior in pursuit of a product is a good thing.
General Motors Parade of Progress, traveling the high roads and byroads of America, bringing to millions of Americans in their own hometown the fascinating story behind modern industry, showing...
The campaign set out to show dramatically that it was business, not politicians, who had created modern America.
A better mode of living for all of us.
Bernays was an advisor to General Motors, but he was no longer alone. The industry he had founded now flourished as hundreds of public relations advisors organized a vast campaign. They not only used advertisements and billboards, but managed to insinuate their message into the editorial pages of the newspapers. It became a bitter fight. In response to the campaign, the government made films that warned of the unscrupulous manipulation of the press by big business. And the central villain was the new figure of the public relations man.
They tried to achieve their ends by working entirely behind the scenes, corrupting and deceiving the public. The aims of such groups may be either good or bad, so far as the public interest is concerned, but their methods are a grave danger to democratic institutions.
The films also showed how the responsible citizen could monitor the press themselves. They could create a chart that analysed the reporting for signs of hidden bias. But such earnest instruction was to be no match for the powerful imagination of Edward Bernays. He was about to help create a vision of the utopia that free market capitalism would build in America if it was unleashed. In 1939, New York hosted the World's Fair. Edward Bernays was a central advisor. He insisted that the theme be the link between democracy and American business. At the heart of the fair was a giant white dome that Bernays named Democracy. And the central exhibit was a vast working model of America's future, constructed by the General Motors Corporation.
To my father, the World's Fair was an opportunity to keep the status quo, that is, capitalism in a democracy. Democracy and capitalism, that marriage, right, linking, just like that. He did that by manipulating people and getting them to think that you couldn't have real democracy in anything but a capitalist society, which was capable of doing anything, of creating these wonderful highways, of making, moving pictures inside everybody's house, of telephones that didn't need cords, of sleek roadsters. I mean, it was consumerist, but at the same time, you inferred that in a funny way, democracy and capitalism went together.
The World's Fair was an extraordinary success and captured America's imagination. The vision it portrayed was of a new form of democracy, in which business responded to people's innermost desires in a way politicians could never do. But it was a form of democracy that depended on treating people not as active citizens as Roosevelt did, but as passive consumers. Because this, Bernays believed, was the key to control in a mass democracy.
it's not that the people are in charge, but that the people's desires are in charge. The people are not in charge. The people exercise no decision-making power within this environment. So democracy is reduced from something which assumes an active citizenry to the idea of the public as passive consumers. Driven primarily by instinctual or unconscious desires, and that if you can in fact trigger those needs and desires, you can get what you want from them.
But this struggle between the two views of human beings as to whether they were rational or irrational was about to be dramatically affected by events in Europe. Events that would also change the fortunes of the Freud family.
So probably one of the best examples of this was the World Fair. For anyone that still remembers that, if you don't, I'd just suggest looking that up. So again, Edward Bernays was part of this. He was hired to try and encourage people to start supporting capitalism and consumerism more. So his creation was the World Fair for people to go and have some entertainment, showcased a whole range of different products and technology that just after the war inspired people, made people feel excited, made people view products as fun, and really changed the whole perspective of products being about a necessity item to products being all about entertainment and fun as well, and really just changing the whole ideology that people had toward consumerism and buying and products, materialistic products, to being basically creating a hope for people through the use of products, and allowed people to feel inspired and as if products were going to be able to make them way happier and give them a better life, and that was like the big key thing. So then supporting consumerism more, and basically the whole objective of that form of propaganda was to have people really supporting political parties that were all about capitalistic systems, and it worked. It was one of the most successful campaigns at really changing people's views toward consumerism and capitalism. And again, it was because they associated all that fun and euphoria that they had that day at the World Fair with being contributed to the materialistic products and the systems of capitalism and consumerism. So another commonly used thing by politicians is flag waving, which is basically an attempt to justify an action on the grounds that doing so will make the person more patriotic. So things like war is a very common thing where they'll use flag waving techniques, but it's also used within the animal ag industry, where they originally had the whole check-off program of the pork on the fork, put some pork on your fork, and then connected that with Australia Day. So then they started running the advertisements of put some pork on your fork to be a true Australian and things like that. So this is known as flag waving appeals. We have framing. This is one I would very strongly suggest spending a lot more time looking into. The way you frame a message or a campaign makes a huge difference to how much support you get from a public. And that's something that advertising companies and political parties really understand, and actually spend millions of dollars looking into and coming up with campaigns every year with this sort of thing. So for activism, that's something really important to study a lot more. So framing is basically a social construction of a social phenomenon, often by mass media, political or social movements, leaders or actors, to selectively influence the individual perception of the meaning to words and phrases. And we have gaslighting. This is a term that's become a bit more well known these days, and people are a bit more informed about what this is now because of that famous novel that was written about gaslighting. So it's basically the persisted denial, misdirection, contradiction, and lying to create doubt, to make the other person question their memory, perception, sanity, or norms. So this is used a little bit in advertising, probably more in politics, but this is actually used most in religions and cults as a form of propaganda. And then we have things like gish gallop, one of my favorite terms, just basically just the use of obnoxiously complex questions to make the opponent appear as if they don't know what they're talking about. It's a very common thing that you'll see used by politicians when they're having political debates with each other, and on things like Q&A and stuff like that. There might be a scientist, they might have a climate scientist on talking about the environment, or a politician, and then they'll have an opposition to that of a politician, and they can't create doubt about the data and the scientific facts they're seeing, so they'll just come up with obnoxiously complex questions that really often don't even have anything to do with what they're talking about, but it'll just make that if that person doesn't answer those questions, then it can make them seem as though they don't know what they're talking about. And we have half-truth, which is a statement or campaign using only half or mixes of truth. We have information overload. This is a very common technique that started being used. This was used more in the 60s, but this is a common technique now that's being used a lot through social media and YouTube, which is basically an overload of information. So the overload prompts disengagement. Then we have things like intentional vagueness. This is something that's that politicians also will quite often do. Probably one of the best examples is Trump. Trump had a lot of his campaign speeches all around intentional vagueness. One of the best examples was one of the famous speeches he gave just after he was elected, where he had a whole range of people from the military appointed, and then just said the simple phrase of "this is the calm before the storm," or something along those lines. Wouldn't answer any media when they asked what did he mean by that. It was completely intentional thing that he had come up with, using the propaganda techniques of intentional vagueness, so that then there would become a whole range of conspiracies, and people would put the meanings to it that supported him, and that way it created things like the whole QAnon theories and a whole range of other stuff come up from that, where he basically got made out to be this intelligent person, or part of this huge conspiracy theory, and become more of like a hero figure, or quite often it'll be used so they'll be associated with being in the know, or a lot more intelligent, or aware of things that are going on than what they actually are. So the definition for this is basically generalities are vague, so the audience will supply their own interpretations. Then we have latitudes of acceptance. So the first technique is to take an extreme position that'll make moderate positions seem more acceptable. The second technique is to moderate one's own position to the edge of latitude of acceptance, and then to move to the position previously held. And we have things like love bombing, which is also known as milieu control. This is something most commonly used in things like cults, new religions and cults. So the cult uses a group of individuals to cut off a person from their existing social support and replace it entirely with members of the group or the cult, who then deliberately provide compliments and affection to isolate the prior beliefs of that person. Then we have things like minimization. This is something as well pretty commonly used with companies like mining companies and things like that, and also with politicians, which is the opposite of exaggeration. Then we have non sequitur, which is a typological fallacy in which conclusions are made of an argument that does not justify it. So basically all invalid arguments are non sequitur. Then we have obfuscation, which is basically just the same sort of thing, intentional vagueness or confusion. We have operant conditioning, another one that's worth looking into a bit more. So operant conditioning involves learning through limitation, which is the underlining principle of repetition and ad nauseum, so like public relations campaigns. Then we have something that's known as, not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly, pensée unique. It's basically enforced reduction of discussion by use of overly simplistic arguments. So consider something like there is no alternative to war. This is a commonly used technique with people like meat eaters and stuff that will try and argue against some pretty like good facts from animal activists, and they'll use just something that's really overly simplistic and basically pointless to argue, where they're just, but I like meat, I'll only continue to eat meat, or plants have feelings too. These sorts of really overly simplistic sorts of arguments that make the conversation pretty pointless. We have things like quotes out of context, which is selective editing of quotes. Editing a quote to change its meaning. We have rationalization. So individuals use favorable generalities to rationalize questionable acts, or vague phrases are often used to justify beliefs. Very common thing used with politicians. Red herring. This is another pretty common thing used by companies and politicians when they're having debates, like a political debate on Q&A or something like that. So it's just basically presenting data or issues that, while compelling, are irrelevant to the argument at hand. We have things like slogans. A slogan is a phrase that includes labeling. We have the straw man technique. This is probably the most common used in political campaigns as well. So a straw man argument is an informal fallacy based on misrepresentation of an opponent's position. Then we have things like testimonial. This is very commonly used in things like advertising and for companies. So testimonials are quotations to support or reject a given policy, action, program, or personality. Often use things like appeals to authority. There's thought-terminating cliches, which is a commonly used phrase used to quell cognitive dissonance. Things like unstated assumption. This technique is used when the concept would seem less credible if explicitly stated. So the concept instead assumes or implies. We have virtue words. These are words in a value system, such as peace, hope, freedom, happiness. This is most commonly used in advertising and political campaigns. And then finally we have whataboutisms. So whataboutism is a variant of, it's known as tu quoque. It's a logical fallacy that attempts to discredit an opponent by claiming hypocrisy. So again, this is something commonly used in political debates, and also companies, often just the general public, in campaigns like farmers versus animal activism, if you think of that, and environmental conservationists, where they'll try and come up with something like that they eat plants or they farm monocrops, and then there's ones where a lot of campaigns where the mining industry will argue about all the different environmental things that an environmental conservationist does that's not good for the environment. It's this whole constant, but what about you eat this, or what about plants, they have feelings too, that sort of thing.
Not inspired by Bill Clinton's vision. They felt betrayed and wanted revenge. Their opportunity came in 1994 with the congressional elections. The Republicans, led by Newt Gingrich, promised huge tax cuts and to dismantle the welfare system. The voters who had defected to Clinton switched sides yet again, and the Republicans won both houses of Congress in a landslide.
Well, I think it's a tremendous vote in favor of smaller government, lower taxes, and in a sense, a renewal of the Thatcher-Reagan tradition. And I think in that sense, it's pretty decisive.
It means that the welfare state is going to be less hospitable for people who are not willing to take responsibility for their own situation. No question about it.
I think today is the beginning of the end of the welfare state.
For Clinton, it was a disaster. Faced with a hostile Congress, there was no way for him to get his reforms through. His personal popularity plummeted, and it seemed certain he would not be re-elected in 2 years' time. In desperation, and without telling his cabinet, Clinton turned for help to one of America's most ruthless political strategists, Dick Morris.
What did he want you to do?
Save his butt. Clinton was in serious trouble. He had lost the '94 election. He had lost control of Congress, and he hired me to come back and help save him. So he was basically asking me to perform roughly the same role as a life preserver would if you're drowning.
What Morris told Clinton was that to win re-election, he would have to transform the very nature of politics. The crucial swing voters in the suburbs now thought and behaved like consumers. The only way to win them back was to forget all ideology and instead turn politics into a form of consumer business. Clinton must try to identify their personal desires and whims and then promise to fulfill them. If he followed those consumer rules, they would follow him.
I said that I felt the most important thing for him to do was to bring to the political system the same consumer rules philosophy that the business community has. Because I think politics needs to be as responsive to the whims and the desires of the marketplace as business is. And it needs to be as sensitive to the bottom line, profits or votes, as a business is. I think that all of this involves really a changed view of the voters, so that instead of treating them as targets, you treat them as owners. Instead of treating them as something that you can manipulate, you treat them as something you need to learn from. And instead of feeling that you can stay in one place and you can manipulate the voters, you need to learn what they want and move yourself to accommodate it.
To get inside the minds of the swing voters, Morris brought lifestyle marketing into politics for the first time. He went to one of America's most prominent market research firms called Penn & Schern and commissioned what they called a neuropersonality poll. It was a massive survey of hundreds of thousands of voters, but the only political questions it asked were to find out whether someone was a swing voter or not. All the other questions were intimate psychological ones, designed to see whether swing voters fell into identifiable psychological types.
Well, we were asking people like, do you think you're the life of the party? Do you think when you see things that you like to have a list and organize them? Do you typically try to plan things ahead, or do you like to be more spontaneous? Where do you like to go? What sports do you like to play? What would you do with your spouse in a romantic weekend? So we were asking people some very personal questions about their own lives, to try to see where the kinds of people that were likely to change their vote also possessing of certain kinds of personality traits. And in fact, they were.
The neuropersonality poll allowed the Clinton team to segment swing voters into different lifestyle types. They were given names like pools and patios, or caps and gowns who were urban intellectuals living in university towns. From this, the team could identify ways in which they could make individuals feel more secure in their chosen lifestyles, just as business had learnt to do with products. Dick Morris called it small-bore politics, tiny details of people's lives and personal anxieties which politics had never even thought about or noticed before, but which now had become the key to winning power.
It was an America that focused on day-to-day practical concerns. Should I wear seatbelts? Should I stop smoking? Should I wear a school uniform? Is my neighborhood being protected? It was not so much a new individualism as the social order as we had known it had broken down. So we got into people's heads, understood their psychology about lifestyle, about values, what they thought was important, what issues they wanted politicians, and particularly the president, to address. And these issues proved to be very, very different from what the conventional wisdom had suggested.
As the election campaign began, Clinton revealed Morris's new approach to a shocked White House. All traditional policies were to be dropped. Instead, he would concentrate exclusively on policies that targeted the worries of the swing voters. V-chips would be fitted into televisions to prevent children from watching pornography. And mobile phones would be fitted into school buses to make parents feel more secure. Dick Morris also persuaded the president to spend his leisure time in the same way as particular groups of swing voters. He sent Clinton on a hunting holiday, dressed in exactly the Gore-Tex outfits a group called Big Sky Families liked. The aim was to reflect swing voters' lifestyles back to them. The Liberals in Clinton's cabinet hated this approach.
I would say, well, Dick, why have a campaign? This was the 1996 campaign. If all the president is going to do is offer up these little bite-sized miniature initiatives that appeal to people's desires, like consumers, buying soap, V-chips that you could put in your televisions so you could make sure that your children did not have pornography, and school uniforms. Why talk about them? They're so mundane and they're so tiny. And he would say back, if we don't do this, we may not get reelected. And I would say, what's the point of getting reelected if you have no mandate to do anything when you're reelected? And he'd say, what's the point of having a mandate if you can't get reelected?
Kids, this is a toy you've got to have.
Look at the fun Debbie and Andy are having with these realistic ride-em toys.
Although it's true there was advertising to children back in the 1950s, the 1960s, even in the 70s, the amount of it was very confined in comparison to today.
You want to get a slinky.
Advertising to kids may have been confined during the 70s, but it was during this period that it would come into its own as an industry, triggering a counter-movement to end youth marketing altogether, and setting in motion a series of policy decisions that would ultimately determine the industry's future.
A seminal event was in the late 70s when the Federal Trade Commission advocated a ban on advertising to children 8 and under.
The Federal Trade Commission staff believes that children are deceived by television advertising, particularly commercials for cereal with sugar in it, and it wants to stop all advertising aimed at young children.
This ban was based in part on concern about sugar cereals and cavities, and also based on research that indicated that children 8 and under did not understand the persuasive intent of advertising.
Are you saying that every message directed to the older child, a child between 8 and 12, is inherently deceptive?
That's right. I think the child cannot bring enough information to bear not to be deceived and to have an unfair trade practice.
So what ended up happening was the industries that were going to be affected, the toy industries, the sugar cereal companies, went to Congress.
And that in an American democratic capitalistic society, we all must learn, top to bottom, to care for ourselves. And what the last thing we need in the next 20 years is a national nanny.
And Congress ended up taking away a lot of the FTC's authority to regulate marketing to children.
Far from addressing consumer advocates' concerns about the impact of advertising on kids, in 1980, Congress passed the FTC Improvement Act. The law mandated that the FTC would no longer have any authority to promulgate any rules regarding children's advertising.
The Congress of the United States, under pressure from advertisers and marketers, actually took away from the Federal Trade Commission the right, the authority to regulate advertising and marketing to children.
And what little remained of government's power to regulate children's advertising would be dealt a final, fatal blow in the early 1980s.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
In the 1980s, this country was in a situation of falling in love with the market, thinking that the market was the solution to everything, and of deregulating industry.
For those of you with television stations, I have an announcement. As you know, I've never liked big government, and I think you will agree there's no reason to substitute the judgment of Washington bureaucrats for that of professional broadcasters.
By 1984, the Reagan administration had completely deregulated children's television. All bets were now off.
Corporations now realized that Congress was not going to do anything to restrict their power to marketing to children, and they now actually had more power.
And lo and behold, a lot of really smart marketers discovered children as a huge market.
In the decades prior to deregulation, kids' consumer spending increased at a modest rate of roughly 4% a year. Since deregulation, it's grown a remarkable 35% every year, from $4.2 billion in 1984 to $40 billion today, an 852% increase.
Deregulation really opened the floodgates for a kind of marketing to children that never existed before the mid-1980s.
And the masters of the universe!
Suddenly, it became okay to create a television program for the sole purpose of selling a toy.
No one can stop the spike-studded armor of the mighty Spikor. Not even me, you muscle-bound porcupine. Not even you, He-Man.
And sure enough, in the year immediately following the congressional action, the 10 best-selling toys were all based on kids' television shows. It was the beginning of a new era for childhood marketing.
As did the worry that had bedeviled corporate America ever since mass production had been invented, that they would produce too many goods. With the new self, consumer desire seemed to have no limit.
In the United States, the concern of companies was always that supply would outstrip demand, that we were producing too much, and that there was not a market for it. You don't hear that kind of talk anymore, because you've gone from a conception of a market of limited needs, and if you fill them, they're filled, to a market of unlimited, ever-changing needs, dominated by self-expressiveness, that products and services can satisfy in an endless variety of ways, and ways that change all the time. And consequently, economies have unlimited horizons.
Out of this explosion of desire came what seemed a never-ending consumer boom that regenerated the American economy. The original idea had been that the liberation of the self would create new kinds of people, free of social constraint. That radical change had happened, but while the new beings felt liberated, they had become increasingly dependent for their identity on business. The corporations had realized that it was in their interests to encourage people to feel that they were unique individuals and then offer them ways to express that individuality. A world in which people felt they were rebelling against conformity was not a threat to business, but its greatest opportunity.
It was, in a sense, the triumph of the self. It was the triumph of a certain self-indulgence, a view that everything in the world and all moral judgment was appropriately viewed through the lens of personal satisfaction. Indeed, the ultimate ending point of that logic is that there is no society. There is only a bunch of individual people making individual choices to promote their own individual well-being.
Previous episodes have shown how the focus group was invented by psychoanalysts employed by US corporations. The aim was to allow consumers to express their inner feelings and needs, just as patients did in psychoanalysis. The information was then used to promote and design new products that would fulfill those desires. And Edward Bernays, who was now nearly 100 years old, was celebrated as the founding father of this marketing world.
Hi, Doctor. Good to see you. Come on up over here. There you go. Doctor, tell me again what the doctor is. What are we dealing with here? You're the father of public relations.
What we're dealing with really is the concept that people will believe me more if you call me doctor.
Oh, I see. It's a good idea.
And Bernays' ideas and techniques were also about to conquer Britain in the 1980s. Unlike America, the ruling elites in Britain had always distrusted the idea of pandering to the masses. It was epitomised by the patrician elite who ran the BBC. Even as late as the 60s, popular programmes were referred to as ground bait. Their real job was to lure the viewers into watching the more serious programmes the elite knew was good for them. And market research reflected this attitude. Individuals were observed and classified by market researchers according to their social class, from A through C2, D and E.
Probably they might be C2s.
Yes, I think by the way they're carrying their luggage, all no taxi, and all stuffed in the bags like that.
I think the lady possibly sets her own hair, which is always an indication.
Yes. Children are nicely dressed.
Yes, they are.
Probably a skilled worker.
A skilled, a skilled worker.
I would say so.
Yes, I would say so. With certain apprenticeship or done some qualifying.
We agree then.
Yes, we think
We think so. Yes.
When people were asked their opinion about both products and politics, they were selected by social class and asked only strictly factual questions about what they thought.
Leaving your own party sympathies on one side, who do you think will win this forthcoming election?
Labour.
Labour?
And tell me which you prefer.
Which party do you think you'll be voting for?
This time, Liberals.
You'll be voting for the Liberals.
And who do you think will be second?
Conservative.
This one.
Thank you.
The idea that one might ask people what they themselves felt and desired, and then give it to them, was seen as alien to the ruling elites, which would challenge their belief that they knew what was best for the public.
There's evidence in other countries, in the United States for example, where pollsters have been used before elections to interpret the mood of the public, and then you give people more what they want to have and less what they ought to have. But again, this could be alleged to be more democratic, I don't know. It's very dangerous ground, I think, though, when polls are used in that way.
But then, in the economic crisis of the mid-70s, British industry was forced to begin to pay attention to the inner feelings of consumers. As the recession deepened, consumer spending fell dramatically, and the advertisers insisted that the only way for companies to survive was to make their advertising more effective. And to do this, they would have to delve into people's underlying psychological motives for purchasing. The advertising industry started to bring in Americans to run focus groups with British housewives.
Everyone is a unique person, and even though you're a group of 10 today, we don't want a group opinion. And we want to know your ideas and your thoughts, no matter how crazy it might be. Please let your imagination run wild, because that's how very crazy things like instant coffee got born. Now, can we get somebody, this lady, to be a kitchen sink? And kitchen sink, how do you feel with these things that are being used to clean you up?
Well, I've got to feel clean. I've got to be kept clean.
So
I feel that. I should hate it if I was all greasy, so I've got to be easy to clean.
Okay, now the housewife, this lady, what would you use to clean your kitchen sink?
A scouring powder. Of course, a cloth to apply the things on, and plenty of water.
Now, how do you feel as you're doing this chore? Feel satisfied?
Well satisfied when I have done it, yes. I'm doing my duty. I feel it's a job well done.
The consumers were encouraged to play at being products, from household cleaners to car seat belts. The aim was not to talk rationally, but to act out and reveal their inner emotional relationship to products.
Which firmly and unmistakably underlines.
And then a politician emerged who also believed that people should be allowed to express themselves. Instead of being controlled by the state, the individual should become the central focus of society.
Some socialists seem to believe that people should be numbers in a state computer. We believe they should be individuals. We're all unequal. No one, thank heavens, is quite like anyone else, however much the socialists may pretend otherwise. And we believe that everyone has the right to be unequal, but to us, every human being is equally important.
So I'll just go into the divisions of how to analyse propaganda. So number one, the ideology and purpose of the propaganda campaign. Number two, the context in which the propaganda occurs. Number three, the identification of the propagandists. Number four, the structure of the propaganda organisation. Number five, the target audience. Number six, media utilisation techniques. Number seven, special techniques to maximise effect. Number eight, the audience reaction to various techniques. Number 9, counter-propaganda if present. And number 10 is the effects and evaluation.
What do you really want?
A tasty product that's good for me.
What do you want that for?
One technique is that we ask people the same question over and over and over again, and we say, what do you want? What do you really want? What do you want that for? And they start to talk about it, and they kind of get intimate with what's going on. What we're doing with that technique is unpeeling the onion. If you want to think of a person kind of having layers and layers and layers of protection and thoughts and behaviors and beliefs, we want to get to that center core.
In the wake of the invention of values and lifestyles, a vast industry of psychological market research grew up. And the old technique of the focus group, invented by the Freudian psychoanalysts in the 50s, was used in a new and powerful way. The original aim of the focus group had been to find ways to entice people to buy a limited range of mass-produced goods. But now focus groups were used in a different way to explore the inner feelings of lifestyle groups, and out of that invent whole new ranges of products, which would allow those groups to express what they felt was their individuality. And the generation who had once rebelled against the conformity imposed by consumerism now embraced it because it helped them to be themselves.
What capitalism managed to do that was brilliant was to actually create products that people like me would be interested in, that people like Jerry Rubin would be interested in. Capitalism developed a whole industry at developing products that evoked a larger sense of self. That seemed to agree with us that the self was infinite, that you could be anything you wanted to be, that took our philosophy and agreed with it, and then created products that supposedly helped you, aids, that helped you be this limitless self. The product sells you a way of life, a way of being. The product sells you values. You dress this way, you live in a house like this, you have furniture like this, you use this computer.
Do you have the regular jeans or? Oh, Gloria Vanderbilt does a lot in denim, in silks, and in cotton.
You eat in these restaurants, there are values there, hipness, coolness,